Until I discovered this $500,000 investment, I'd always believed my parents were simply trying to teach me the value of independence. I'd grown up in a home that prided itself on self-reliance, where every modest success was celebrated and every failure was a lesson. My mother, a woman who wore pearls even when vacuuming, reminded me to keep my chin up no matter how severe the storm overhead. But there's independence, and there's cruelty. There's a line we all hope never to see our parents cross. And yet, they crossed it with me. I had a serious spinal issue that required a complicated surgery. The pain was so debilitating that sometimes I'd wake up in tears, unable to stand for more than a few minutes. I approached them for help because even with insurance, the bills were astronomical. My husband, Glenn, was supportive, but his freelance photography work wasn't exactly making us rich. When my parents flat out refused to help, I swallowed my pride and used credit cards, personal loans, and every scrap of savings we had. I felt the sting of their refusal deeply, but I assumed their finances might have been strained, or they wanted me to learn some twisted lesson about self-sufficiency. I didn't realize how false that assumption was until 2 weeks after my surgery. I was in recovery, heavily medicated, drifting between sleep and a dull awareness of my body screaming in pain. Glenn was rummaging through the kitchen drawers, looking for an old receipt he needed for tax purposes. By pure accident, he stumbled upon a bank statement that didn't belong to us. My parents had used our address for some reason, an oversight, presumably, and there it was in black and white, an investment of $500,000. At first, I thought I'd misread it. My parents had never shown any sign of being that wealthy, and yet there was the statement, detailing their major deposit into a new venture. The real shock came when I looked closer at the name on the account. It was my husband's ex-wife, Darla, who had opened a bakery cafe 2 counties over. Darla, the same woman who tried to win Glenn back a few months before our wedding, was receiving a massive investment from my mother and father. The heartbreak I felt eclipsed any physical pain. It was as though the surgical incision had split open inside my heart instead, impossible to ignore. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, chalking it up to some business arrangement I'd never heard about. Maybe Darla had pitched an opportunity, and my parents, always searching for profitable ventures, decided to invest for financial gain. But it felt too personal to be a coincidence, especially since they'd refused to contribute even a fraction of that amount for my surgery. Glenn and I had only asked them for $30,000, a sum that, while significant, was nowhere near $500,000. It was the disparity that gnawed at me, the betrayal that made my stomach twist. Before I confronted my parents, I called Darla. I'd never been close with her, and I had spent most of my emotional energy trying not to resent her for the turmoil she caused in my marriage's early days. When I mentioned my parents' names, she sounded surprised at first but quickly recovered, as though she realized she'd said too much. She admitted to receiving funds from them, but insisted it was strictly professional. I could almost hear the smugness in her voice, though. She spoke as if I'd called to congratulate her on her new windfall, oblivious to how deeply her words cut. I wanted to scream, but I remained coldly composed when I next called my parents. My father answered, sounding as though he'd been expecting me. His voice carried that familiar blend of condescension and impatience. He asked how my recovery was going, but didn't wait for the answer. Instead, he bluntly confirmed they'd invested in Darla's business. He tried to spin it as a promising venture, claiming I'd understand if I weren't so oversensitive. My mother got on the line too, but she mostly parroted his sentiments. The message was loud and clear. They had money to invest, just not in me. When I asked why they'd ignored my pleas for help, my father retorted that my medical issues were my responsibility. The justification, in his eyes, was that I'd chosen a low-paying career path. He scolded me for failing to choose a lucrative field, as if that justified letting me drown in bills. And then, in a moment of frosty finality, my mother offered a dismissive laugh. "You're not stable enough to handle our money," she said. "We've had concerns for years." I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a cold determination that they would regret. I suppose I'm drifting off topic here, but let me just say, life can be a real bar brawl sometimes, you know? It's like you're standing there, minding your business, and suddenly you get whacked on the back of the head with a bottle. But anyway, let's get back on track. After that call, something inside me hardened. I was no longer the daughter seeking approval. I was a wounded survivor who demanded respect. Glenn tried to comfort me, but I sensed his own turmoil. Darla's presence in our lives had never fully disappeared, and this investment only deepened the wounds. We were not on the brink of divorce or anything, but tension simmered. I refused to let my parents and Darla overshadow my recovery, though. As I healed physically, I grew mentally stronger. Each day, I'd wake up, do my physical therapy, and then research every aspect of their deal. I reached out to old connections, searching for any scrap of inside information. The more I learned, the angrier I became. My parents had not just invested in Darla's bakery cafe, they had formed a partnership that gave them partial ownership and seats on the board. They were actively nurturing her success. Maybe I sound bitter, but when your own flesh and blood sides with a person who once tried to steal your husband, it's soul-crushing. My mother had even accompanied Darla on a trip to Europe to sample pastries, or so I'd heard through the grapevine. They were bonding over cappuccinos in Paris while I'd been lying in a hospital bed, unsure whether I'd walk without pain again. The resentment swelled within me like a tide, but I refused to let it drown me. Instead, I used it as fuel. One day, I discovered through a friend in banking that Darla's cafe was generating solid profits, but the overhead was substantial. If there was a downturn in the local economy or a scandal that hurt her reputation, she could lose everything. The business was, in fact, a high-risk venture. That knowledge pricked my curiosity. I wasn't looking for ways to sabotage an innocent person's livelihood. I just didn't see Darla as innocent. She had meddled in my marriage, and now she was in bed financially with my toxic parents. If they all thought I was too unstable to protect myself, I would prove them wrong by hitting them where it hurt most, their wallets. I consulted an old college friend who specialized in investigative journalism, and together we brainstormed. We uncovered sourcing practices for Darla's imported coffee beans. Her supplier was rumored to engage in unethical labor practices, though nothing had been proven. My friend suggested there might be an angle to explore further, a story that could tarnish Darla's brand if it ever went public. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was short-lived. The more I thought about what my parents had done, the more I wanted them to feel a fraction of the betrayal I'd endured. Glenn noticed my late-night phone calls and research. He asked if I was plotting something, and I told him I was protecting our interests. A part of me wanted him on board, but I suspected he might balk. He had never been the vengeful type, even after Darla's past attempts to rekindle their romance. Instead, he nodded, choosing to trust me. "Just don't do anything that lands us in jail," he half-joked. That was never my intent. I wasn't going to plant evidence or commit any crime. All I needed was one crack in their carefully built facade, then I'd let nature run its course. Over the next few weeks, my journalist friend and I quietly collected data. We confirmed that Darla's supplier operated in a region notorious for child labor violations. My friend planned to publish a nuanced exposé highlighting the chain of responsibility, from the coffee fields to the cafe owners. It wasn't a hit piece specifically targeting Darla, but her business would inevitably become a focal point once the article went live. Meanwhile, I recorded every smug voicemail my parents left, every dismissive remark they made about my lack of ambition. They had no clue I was building a fortress of evidence against them. I played the dutiful daughter in public, sending them polite text messages about my recovery progress. I wanted them complacent, unsuspecting. Glenn found it difficult to keep up the charade, but I reminded him it was necessary. By the time I was cleared by my doctor to resume normal activities, I had a stack of documents detailing exactly how much they'd poured into Darla's venture, complete with shady tax write-offs. 1 week before the exposé was set to publish, I scheduled a face-to-face meeting with my parents. I intended to give them one final chance to address the situation before the fallout. They agreed to meet at a restaurant they favored, a swanky steakhouse downtown. I arrived early, choosing a corner booth where no one could eavesdrop. My mother walked in first, wearing a tailored suit that practically screamed, "I'm better than you." My father followed, sporting that self-assured smirk I'd grown to despise. They barely asked about my health before delving into stories about Darla's successful expansions. When I finally steered the conversation to the unethical coffee sourcing, my father brushed it off with a wave of his hand, claiming, "Business is business." I leaned forward, heart pounding. This is not just business. It's illegal activity tied to potential child labor abuses. Are you really willing to be part of that? My mother rolled her eyes, reminding me how emotional I could get. My father told me to stop meddling in affairs I couldn't understand. He added that if I kept pushing, they'd cut me out of the family entirely. That was the moment I realized they weren't simply misguided. They had crossed a moral line and felt no shame. My father's final words before leaving the table echoed in my head. We invested wisely. You're just too unstable to see it. I paid the bill for our dinner, feeling a surge of anger that rattled me to the core. Paying for their meal felt symbolic, as though I was literally funding their cruelty. But I kept my composure, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me erupt. By the time I got home, I discovered a text from my mother. We're worried about you. Please seek professional help. The condescension was unbearable, yet it fueled my resolve. 2 days later, the expose went public. The story was bigger than I had anticipated, drawing attention not only to Darla's Cafe, but to a network of establishments that relied on this supplier. Local news outlets picked it up, and soon the cafe's grand reputation started to crack. Darla went into damage control mode, issuing a statement claiming she had no knowledge of the supplier's practices. My parents, listed as co-owners, received their fair share of scrutiny. Journalists reached out to them for comment, and I heard through mutual acquaintances that they were furious, suspecting me but lacking proof. Meanwhile, customers began boycotting Darla's business. It wasn't a death blow, she could still recover, but the first fissure in their empire had formed, and I intended to widen it. Glenn watched everything unfold with a mix of fascination and trepidation. He worried about potential lawsuits, but nothing we'd done was illegal. Information was public record once the article was out. One evening, Darla herself called Glenn, sobbing that her business was on the verge of collapse. She accused me of orchestrating the entire scandal. Glenn handed me the phone, and I listened to her alternate between pleas for mercy and vicious insults. I told her calmly that this was only the beginning. She hung up, leaving me with a twisted sense of satisfaction. That same week, I leaked the tax records my parents had filed jointly with Darla. A journalist friend helped me anonymize the source, ensuring there was no direct link back to me. The documents revealed questionable deductions and potential tax evasion. A small storm erupted on social media, with people calling for audits and official investigations. My parents and Darla tried to present a united front, claiming they had no knowledge of any impropriety, but the narrative had already taken shape. Wealthy investors exploiting shady loopholes and unethical suppliers for profit. Their once pristine image was unraveling thread by thread, and I watched with cold, calculated focus. At this point, I knew forgiveness was off the table. My parents had shown their true colors, and Darla had proven she'd do anything to save her own skin, including painting me as a mentally unstable saboteur. I found new testimonies from disgruntled former employees of Darla's Cafe who alleged that wages were withheld or late. I passed these stories along to my journalist friend. Within days, more articles emerged, painting a grim picture of workplace exploitation. Legal authorities began to sniff around, and though it would take time for any charges to materialize, the negative press was relentless. Meanwhile, Glenn confessed that part of him pitied Darla. She'd once been his partner, after all, but even he couldn't ignore the evidence stacking up. I told him that pity was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not after my parents had called me unstable and abandoned me in my time of need. I had a small flashback to the morning I'd tried to stand from bed, the pain in my spine so severe I nearly collapsed. Where were they then? Off gallivanting around, taste-testing croissants with Darla. The memory steeled my conviction. I would see this through to its bitter end. My parents finally reached out directly, demanding I meet them in person. We arranged a tense gathering at my childhood home. Their faces were drawn, years older than the last time I saw them. They'd lost business associates, old friends had distanced themselves, and my mother's favorite charity had turned down her donation, not wanting to be tied to a scandal. They pleaded for me to deny any involvement. My father actually tried to bribe me, offering a chunk of money to pay off my medical debt if I'd publicly defend them. I laughed in his face. I reminded him that he'd watched me suffer and refused to help. Now he wanted to buy me off because his own reputation was at stake? That was when he snapped, calling me ungrateful and deranged. My mother sobbed, insisting they'd always loved me but had worried about my emotional stability. The hypocrisy was overwhelming. I stood up, shaking with rage, and told them, love doesn't look like abandonment. Love doesn't favor a stranger over your own child. I said they'd made their bed the day they chose Darla's business over my life-saving surgery. Now they had to lie in it alone. In the following weeks, investigations ramped up. Authorities subpoenaed financial documents, and rumors swirled about potential charges. Darla's Cafe saw a sharp decline in customers, and her expansion plans fell apart. My parents tried to rally support from extended family, but most chose to keep their distance, not wanting to be tainted by the unfolding disaster. I, on the other hand, felt a strange calm settle over me. My medical bills were still looming, but with careful budgeting, I managed them. Glenn landed a lucrative photography gig, which eased some of our financial strain. As for me, I'd returned to social work, quietly helping others even as I orchestrated the downfall of my own flesh and blood. One evening, while sipping tea, I received an email from a reporter asking for a comment on my parents' and Darla's claims that I'd masterminded the entire smear campaign. My statement was simple: I have no comment on baseless accusations. All information regarding unethical sourcing and financial misdeeds is public record. That was it. No denials, no confessions. Let them twist in the wind. I knew the truth. Yes, I'd orchestrated it, but they had handed me the ammunition. All I did was pull the trigger. 3 months later, Darla declared bankruptcy. My parents, facing crippling legal fees, sold off assets to pay their defense team. They even listed the family home for sale, the one where I'd grown up. People asked if I felt guilty watching them lose everything. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. I felt justice. They'd turned their backs on me in my darkest hour, believing I was too weak, too unstable to stand on my own. I'd proven them wrong. I stood taller than ever, even if a scar on my spine reminded me daily of their betrayal. As for Glenn, he remained by my side. Our marriage grew stronger through the ordeal, united by a shared understanding that betrayal should never be excused. We watched from the sidelines, hand in hand, as Darla's Cafe shut its doors, as my parents scrambled to salvage their shattered reputations. When people asked why I never forgave them, I quoted something I once read: "Forgiveness is wasted on those who don't seek it." My parents and Darla never once showed true remorse, so I left them to live with the ruin they'd created. In the end, I walked away with my dignity intact, and that was the sweetest revenge.